Turning now to Russia's war on Ukraine, and Ukrainian officials say its troops are advancing in a counteroffensive on the southern front lines.
So Ukraine is trying to advance to the Sea of Azov. They hope to cut the land bridge between Crimea and the occupied eastern Donetsk region. Even some pro-Kremlin military bloggers are conceding that Russian troops are under intense pressure. Meantime, Russian investigators have also recovered 10 bodies in the flight data recorders from that plane crash that is believed to have killed Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Russian President Vladimir Putin offered his condolences to Prigozhin's family, but the Kremlin still vehemently denies any involvement in the crash. CNN Salma Abdelaziz joining us now from London with the very latest. Hi, Salma.
Hello. We don't have a timeline yet, Rahel and Amara, on how long this forensic analysis, DNA analysis, will take by Russian investigators. But what we do know is, as you mentioned, 10 bodies recovered from the scene, as well as the flight recorder data. So you can expect right now that that's being looked at by this government-backed body. And it comes just days after, or just shortly after, rather, President Putin broke his silence on this plane crash, speaking of Prigozhin in the past tense, describing him as a talented man who made serious mistakes. Look, very few who are supporters of Prigozhin in the Western Intelligence Agency, even President Biden himself, are surprised that Prigozhin may very well have met this fate. In fact, the only thing that was surprising was that for 2 months he seemed to be a dead man walking, posing the most serious threat to President Putin's rule in nearly 2 decades. Now the question is, can these Russian investigators carry out an independent analysis without meddling? You'll have to remember, of course, this plane crash took place on Russian territory. These investigators are government-backed. For Western intelligence agencies, for supporters of Prigozhin, that's going to put a lot of question marks as to whether or not this is truly an independent body. Now, the Kremlin has, of course, denied any involvement in this crash, calling any finger-pointing absolute lies. But of course, over the course of the last several years, from here in England in the Salisbury poisonings to Alexei Navalny, we've seen Kremlin critics meet very mysterious fates, from poisonings to falling off balconies. That means we're very unlikely to get true, independent, and transparent answers as to what happened.
Selma, you say that it wasn't necessarily a surprise that Yevgeny Prigozhin would ultimately meet his death in this way 2 months after that mutiny. What do we know about what Prigozhin knew or thought about any threats to his life? Any reporting there?
Look, you can absolutely assume that Prigozhin was worried for his life, to say the least. He was someone who was openly criticizing members of President Putin's government, all the way up to the Minister of Defense, and was doing it very openly, of course, on social media. In fact, one of the people who warned Prigozhin about possible death threats, apparently twice, is a close Putin ally, Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, who said he had time and time again warned Prigozhin, and that at one point Prigozhin responded to Lukashenko by saying, well, then I'll die, forget about it, this very bombastic response. Now, Lukashenko in that interview went on to say that he does not believe President Putin is behind this, but absolutely, this was a man who feared that he could be killed for speaking out.
And we know he certainly kept a low profile after that failed mutiny, with the exception of that forum in St. Petersburg. Salma Abdelaziz, live for us in London. Salma, thank you.
All right, let's talk more about this deadly crash, Prigozhin, and what this means for the future with CNN Global Affairs analyst Kimberly Dozier. Good morning to you, Kimberly. So, obviously these denials from the Kremlin rings hollow to anyone inside and outside Russia who knows what exactly happens to critics of Putin, the Kremlin. This is all part of the playbook, and I guess there really is no advantage, I think that's what you've said, for Putin to even come out and say, yes, I did it, if he indeed was behind it.
Yeah, this is the Putin playbook, to deny, deny, deny. Remember, Putin denied that they were going to invade Ukraine until Russian troops were actually inside the country. By keeping several different stories out there, by keeping people guessing, he keeps his adversaries off balance, and the message still gets through. This was a man, Prigozhin, who his influence came from his positioning with Putin, his closeness to Putin. And once he had offended the man, he, in a sense, lost protection. We may never know who ordered this. Was it Putin himself, or was it someone in the upper ranks of power who wanted to make a move to take over Wagner, or who simply wanted to possibly curry favor with the boss by taking out someone who'd embarrassed Putin on the world stage? Either thing is makes a lot of sense. The ultimate result is that the top leadership of the Wagner Group was on that plane, with the exception of the executive director, who hadn't taken part in the coup. So you've sliced off the ideological people who were a challenge towards Putin and Mother Russia and the war in Ukraine, and you've left intact the Wagner structure, which has been very useful to the Russian government in places like Africa, operating as a de facto arm of the state.
Let me jump in there, though, Kimberly, because that is, I mean, it's surprising to me, really. I mean, you have Prigozhin, who wasn't born yesterday. He's on the same flight as two of his top lieutenants, who apparently were part of this attempted mutiny. I mean, do you really think that Prigozhin felt like he was out of the woods, that he would get on a flight like this with his top two lieutenants and I guess break security protocol?
Well, you have to look at the relationship, at least as far as any of us could tell what it was, between Prigozhin and Putin, and it seemed like a very close friends. We're talking sort of mafia territory, and Prigozhin had to make a call when he looked into Putin's eyes when they had that meeting after their small insurrection, and decided apparently that it was safe to continue in his orbit. And he could have altered his behavior. He could have stayed in Africa. He could have also, as you mentioned, he popped up in Petersburg, St. Petersburg, at an event that Putin was at. And he also had started churning out some videos on the Wagner network again from visits to Africa. He might not have understood that he needed to keep a low profile, show more shame, and perhaps hide in Belarus. He kept spending a lot of time in Russia. We don't know if that offended Putin's ego, or if it gave one of the Russian military commanders around Putin an opportunity to take out. Prigozhin had been criticizing them for months. He was an embarrassment and a threat to a lot of the other people around the top level of power. And so they made a power move. Again, I think even if US or British intelligence figure it out, they're not going to share it with us, because it's business as usual, and a top critic is gone, and the Russian war against Ukraine continues.
So 15 seconds, because you mentioned, just the Wagner Group's influence in Africa, Syria, and other places as well. What happens next to the Wagner Group? Because there's thousands of mercenaries now, some of them stranded around the globe. Does Putin absorb them into the Russian armed forces, or what? What happens?
I think he goes back to the pre-Prigozhin model of small groups, not a monolithic entity like Wagner that could rise to threaten his power or the Russian state, as Prigozhin did. There will never be another Wagner like it was. It's going to be entities that they can play off each other, that won't stage another coup.